Creation Story, Book 1 of 6. This text is not to be edited, altered, summarized, or translated into any language. Offenders who attempt to will be charged with treason against Khalil and put to death. In the beginning, God created the universe and all within it, using singular bursts of energy that came from deep within his very soul. For billions of years, he watched the planets he had created come into being, and then thrive or fail based on their size and proximity to his other creations. Balance was the key to creating something truly spectacular, and when God understood this, he positioned one very special planet just so, between the sun and its own small moon, so it would neither burn nor freeze. Pleased by his progress and spurred on by a sense of self-satisfaction, God focused all of his concentration there, abandoning the other planets in favor of perfecting the planet that we have always called Earth. He did not know why he was doing this, only that he had the urge and the ability to create, and that if he did not, he would surely suffocate under the dense weight of his own power. God loved the earth and its diversity, but it was far from perfect and required his constant focus, influence, experimentation, and reflection. There were centuries of ice, centuries of beasts, and centuries of nothing but the symphony of insect songs. And though it took him eons of time to get the geography of the world just right, he created like a painter in possession of every colour, until eventually God convinced himself that the surface of the planet was perfect, harmonious, and most importantly, it made him feel more than overwhelmed for once. It made him feel complete. God toyed with the world like a child full of wonder, making oceans rise and fall, wiping out species when he realized that they were incompatible with the terrain, or then wiping out the terrain to sustain preferred species. Some parts of the earth had to go without in order for others to flourish, and yet every inch of it served some purpose and brought him joy and entertainment. But as time went on, God began to grow dissatisfied with his favourite possession, and with that dissatisfaction came lethargy, and that lethargy weakened him and made it harder for him to influence anything. He loved Earth, but his creation was so perfect and so balanced that he'd become irrelevant to it, and he worried that without purpose, he'd soon blink out like one of the many stars that he had abandoned. Afraid that his time to enjoy the universe would soon run out, God decided to spend what little time he had left upon Earth with the other creatures that he had made, hoping to bond with another life in some way before he became extinct, so that at least one being would remember him after he was gone. God had made many magnificent things with his energy, but his very favourite was a place, a garden full of ponds and fragrant blossoms and lush green grass that he called Eden. It was indeed perfect, and the animals that enjoyed it were more content than any others anywhere else, so he decided that this would be his home. God made himself into a creature that he thought would be perfectly compatible with his paradise. He gave himself hands that could touch the flowers, similar to those of the primates, legs to stand upon, wings to fly like the birds, and a mouth and throat that he could use to expel his joy and fear when he was overcome. He revelled in Eden, and though he was weak enough to be subjected to pain, exhaustion, and hunger, he explored the earth from there using his feet or his wings, and sometimes by willing himself a tail, so he could submerge into the oceans and lakes. God lived with these beings for his last years as a human, sharing all that he had done and enjoying all that he had created through their eyes, and in time they began to love one another, and he called them his soulmates, for they were each an extension of him. They expressed their affection for one another physically with kisses and caresses, and intimate looks and conversations, and after bouts of frantic couplings, the females would give birth to tiny little versions of themselves, who they would love and coddle in other ways. God approved of this reproduction process heartily, and encouraged the males and females to do this often, because every time a new soul came into the world, he grew stronger from their love in a way that he had never had from the other creatures in the kingdom. To further spur them on, he gifted the winged beings with dozens of infant humans. He was not powerful enough anymore to give them all wings or tails, but each new life was a divine in its own way, and he adored them, wishing that he could know fatherhood too, but he'd grown too old and frail to do such a thing with his weary body. But the people he had created kept his heart beating and cuddled him and for him. That was reward enough after billions of years of loneliness. After a decade, there were hundreds of these humans coexisting within the boundaries of Eden, and they all looked to God as their leader and loved him so that his heart began to pound with power once more. Eventually, God realized that he'd been so revived by their love that he suddenly had a choice to make: live on with the humans or return to his omnipotent form. God didn't like having to make such a choice, but the urge to rest and then create something new was too strong for him to ignore, so he decided in the end to leave this earth to the humans. He would miss his soulmates, but he also knew that he would be able to protect them more easily in his true form, and that would guarantee their ongoing love. And they were in need of protection, for the rapid rates of their reproduction were beginning to throw their paradise out of balance. Soon there would not be enough room or sustenance in Eden to accommodate all of them, and God was determined to shield them from the flaws in his perfect design outside of the garden, like the rains that had been falling far too long on the rest of the country, inundating the land with water and making hunting difficult outside of Eden, and the sorrow that caused the feathers to fall from every set of wings belonging to the descendants of his original 12. and the only way he could be everywhere at once was if he was nowhere at all. God knew without a doubt that love was all that mattered. Love was what he had been trying to create for himself from the very beginning. Giving up the ability to feel it in a human way would be a sacrifice, but he made that sacrifice, leaving them with just enough power to each to ascertain they would be able to protect one another when he was at rest. They farewelled him with tears, and no sooner had he returned to his spirit form did God feel himself throb with the power of undying love. He halted the reins immediately, flexing his power for the first time in 100 years, and then made the dark sky shadow with 1,000,000 brilliant falling stars for their pleasure. This feat instantly exhausted him and his spirit, demanded that he rest, but he left one large one burning steadily above even to remind them of his power and presence, even if they would no longer be able to see him with their human eyes. Asterisk. God had created the soulmates in his human likeness inside and out, and though he believed beyond a shadow of a doubt that they all loved as fiercely as he did, and wanted the same thing that he did, God himself was flawed, and this became apparent to him as soon as he was out of their sight, and they all within his. He could only see their weaknesses reflected in some of their actions, but he could feel all their emotions, and some were so turbulent that he himself shook with uncertainty. Would he love them still? Would he be able to protect them? Would they need a leader in his absence that they could follow? Or would the star be enough? They didn't know, and so neither did he. Their love and faith in him flickered, and so did his power. He tried to send more stars to remind them of his love again, but he could not do so without conviction, and so he resigned himself to rest and to think it over. The soulmates began to argue over these things as soon as he was gone, and they found many issues to bicker about in those first days when the land outside of Eden remained waterlogged from the year-long deluge, forcing them to remain together without a leader for the first time ever. The original soulmates could have flown to higher, drier ground, but their hearts were too heavy with fear of the unknown to do so, and so they sat and waited for the conditions to improve without them having to take such a risk. This proximity only spurned more discontent. The soulmates did not always like sharing, especially when it came to coupling, for some were preferred to others because of their eye colour or physical shape. Some had more power than others, so the weaker ones would grow jealous and paranoid or greedy as they tried to attain what they had not been born with. Some hoarded apples, some amassed stashes of glittering stones, and some protected their favourite trees or lakes and sleeping places from the rest, and some of the males attempted to claim possession over females or offspring, regardless of how the person they were fighting over felt about it. It was chaos that would have been easily fixed, but only the first soulmate created, Miguel, had the courage to actually leave Eden and seek out a new home. It took him a long time to find somewhere as lovely as Eden, but in the end he settled on a forested coastline from which he could watch the setting sun sink low into the water, and remember God without having to listen to anybody squabbling. And because Miguel was the favourite of all the soulmates and Nephilim females, many flew after him, or begged that he carry them there, and he obliged many of them, because although he craved peace and harmony, he craved the act of copulation more. So much so that he found it difficult to make it through an evening without taking a woman first. Naturally, this caused a lot of arguments among the women as each strove to hold his attention for as long as possible, or bear him the most children. But Miguel considered himself to be a fair man, and so he shared himself evenly off to stave the resentment and jealousy. Only one woman amongst them was capable of stealing his heart, but the beautiful soulmate Satan refused to be drawn into the rivalry over his interest, and told him that she would not lie with him until he was certain that she was all he could need. Miguel enjoyed fathering children too much to limit to himself to only one person to procreate with, but he gave Satan his love and his promise that when he was ready to father his last child, it would be her he came to, and remain with forevermore. This made Satan melancholy, and yet she loved Miguel too much to fall for anybody else, so she agreed to be patient and remain his closest companion until the day came when he was ready to be her only companion. God found it difficult to see what all the humans were doing now that they were so many, so he returned for a brief visit to assess how the soulmates were faring without him there, and found himself in a state of vexation after. Despite Miguel's attempts to set a wonderful example, a few of the women had started to hate God for not making them as pretty or valuable to Miguel as Satan was, and so he paid Miguel a visit and asked him to seriously consider cutting them all loose and choosing just one, and perhaps not the lovely Satan, for she made so many women feel badly about themselves with her radiance. Miguel agreed to think that over, and so God went on, checking on the others and finding more and more dissent, despite how far they had spread. His beings were like sheep in need of a shepherd to follow, and without him there to defer to, they continued to bicker over who had what, and God knew that this problem would escalate as they increased in number and encountered more and more unfamiliar creatures and dangers. Knowing the lack of balance on the earth was the cause of their fearful hearts, and that he'd wither away if he stayed on this suddenly conflicted earth for too long, God decided that what he needed to do was to return to his corporeal form and create another world, one that was completely balanced, completely safe, and where they could all live as he did in his spirit form, as pure energy and love that wanted for nothing. It would be a paradise in his kingdom, and it would be all anyone would ever need. But God was tired, his people unhappy, and when he tried to create this new paradise, he found it difficult to think or plan with a weary heart and consciousness. He had existed as energy for millennia, and yet 100 years as a human had altered his spirit to the point where he felt that he needed more than what he actually did to function. He missed being human. He missed sleep with dreams and eating and laughing, and the fact that he could not enjoy these things anymore, but could feel the heartache of those who could and yet did not appreciate it, began to eat at him like acid, until he felt as resentful of the humans as they did of one another. Mindful that these poignant emotions of his were weakening him, and that it would take him years and years to create the utopia he wanted while suffering from such internal conflict, God split himself into two parts, discarding everything negative and weak, and casting those things aside, keeping only what was pure and good and strong. This made him weaker, far, far weaker, but it gave him focus and made him feel pure. There was no more lust, no more hunger, no more envy, only good, only love with no distractions. Using his mind and his heart instead of returning to the earth, God told his soulmates what he had done, why he had done it, and that he was now as perfect as Eden, and that he expected them all to strive towards emulating him in every way that they could, even if it was difficult to overlook their own shortcomings. He declared that the ones who succeeded in shirking off their weak traits as he had would be rewarded, and reminded them that only their love would sustain him. He told them to go on as they had with him, to love, create, breed and learn, and discover more of the world as Miguel had. He wanted them to build more gardens and give him more humans to love, until he could come for them and take them all to this new perfect place that he is going to bless them with. But he warned them that creating this place would preoccupy him, and so it would be up to them to protect one another. They had to work together to survive the things that he would not be able to shield them from until his strength returned. Things like fire and flash floods, and creatures that might bite or stomp them. But he told them not to worry, for they had what it took to care for and protect one another in the power that he had bestowed upon them all, so long as they had love and faith that he would return. Then he began to work without resentment or boredom, and trusted in his soulmates to do the right thing on earth. God's soulmates were grateful to finally be told what to do, and so they immediately began to follow his guidance. When one got ill, they would all be healed by another, and when all grew thirsty, another soulmate would call forth the rain to soak the land. This exhausted the soulmates, and over generations, their powers began to fade, until their lives created were born weak with only a flicker of soul in their hearts, but pure minds and spirits. The ones who had powers were called Nephilim, the ones without, mortals. But they all still had love. For years they bred and laughed and loved and learned of loss, and then, when there were too many of them to keep track of, they began to scatter and grow more courageous. Things were different across the seas. Some lands were freezing cold, others hot and bright, and the beings who ventured into these extreme climates were altered physically by the climate until they all began to look less like God's human form, and more like separate races, and when he checked on them during periods of rest, God delighted in these changes. Only the original soulmate still had power and youth hundreds of years later, but the human people were happy for the most part, and loved him even without a likeness to him. They were all equal in his eyes, but not in one another's. And when Satan realized that a woman's heart could not be shared as easily as a man's body, her pain would explode in a burst of energy that would prove to shape the world as much as God's first act of creation had. End of the first book of creation.